sure it works.
Hello everybody and welcome to a new edition of this show that is called Strange Times. Today we had so many difficulties to make this work, but we are here. I'm your host, as always, Leopoldo Pérez Obregón. And in this show we feature scholars to talk about the things that they are confused about, and then we go over confusions of my own about the topics they know very well. Today, without much introduction, we have George Papaconstantinou. George, welcome to Strange Times.
Good to be here. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Oh my God. This has been a very strong setup. As you know, we have been in the celebrations of the university and then cables got mixed. So yeah.
It's the overload from the 50th anniversary.
Jesus. We're aging poorly. George, what are you confused about?
So I'm confused about many things, but I'll give you a few and then you can pick which ones you want to explore further. First one I'm confused about is this incredible, I wrote a whole book trying to explain my confusion away, and that's this fundamental contradiction between two things. One, we are more interconnected than ever, and two, we don't seem to collectively agree on how to handle this interconnectedness. So this almost like a clash between supply and demand in terms of how we can pursue collective action in an interdependent and fragmented world. That's my first confusion. My second confusion, which is related to the first, is how does Europe fit in this? And why is it that Europe needs always a crisis to be able to rise to the occasion? It's got a golden opportunity to do it. Why isn't it doing it? There's many low-hanging fruits and we're simply not reaching them. That's my second confusion. My third confusion, which is again related to the second, is two economists have many things to say about the world at the moment. It seems that our tools are not terribly well adapted anymore. Our idea that things work with incentives and disincentives, we don't seem to understand politics very well. And we used to think that everything run by economics, but it doesn't seem to be anymore. So these are three main things, and then I could throw in AI, which is one thing that is really confusing me, but we can leave that to the end.
Let's try to cover them all sequentially if we have time. So your first confusion, the world is in a moment where we need collective action the most, and yet we don't seem to be able to do it. Why do you think this is the case?
I think there's a number of reasons. There's contestation both in the developed and the emerging economies about globalization because people feel that it hasn't delivered. And it's true that globalization has delivered in the aggregate, but it's got winners and losers. So this backlash is pushing against any kind of collective action in individual fields, from trade to climate to competition to migration, for sure. That's an important field. Then there's diverging preferences as the world kind of fragments. Different poles, different blocks have different norms, different ideas. It was a hubris to think at the fall of the Berlin Wall that it was the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama had said. We are now living the revenge of history because we thought that everyone was going to adapt to a kind of Western model of liberal democracy. That's not all the case. So you got this real different views of what the world should be run on, what democracy is and what it isn't, and what values people should espouse, and that also acts against finding collective action. So this kind of diverse preferences, together with the fact that you've got intense rivalry at the moment, and the fact that the world has pivoted to Asia, these are some of the factors that show this, that explain this mismatch between interdependence on the one hand, which is bigger than any time before, and fragmentation on the other, which means that we cannot together decide on collective action to serve global public goods or to avoid behavior that is fundamentally problematic in international trade or international finance.
There is one thing that you have not mentioned, but is very obvious, which is also that the US has stepped back from putting together this system with their armies and with their will. So we live in an era where, I don't know, where you were in the moment of managing crisis. Even in Europe, it was an economic crisis, but the US was somehow of an ally. That has changed. Can you see, with the pieces that we have more or less a direction of where we are heading?
A big question to ask is whether what we're seeing in the US is an aberration and we're going to see a reversion to the mean after the Trump era or not. And I fear that it is not an aberration, it is a direction. Right. So, you mentioned the crisis. So indeed, when during the eurozone crisis, in a pivotal moment, it was Obama that stepped in and convinced Chancellor Merkel to move, because the US had lived through a Lehman Brothers episode and was afraid that if there was no similar guarantee of no default for any country in the eurozone, Europe would live through the same, and they would pollute the US. So the US played a pivotal role there. Yeah. Fast forward to today, can we see the US today playing similar roles? No. We're not even sure if the new Federal Reserve Chair is going to extend the currency swap arrangement that is a stabilizing factor in the world financial system. So across a number of policy areas, and trade is an obvious one, there have been changes that crossed administrations. Remember, the challenge to the WTO and to what it stands for didn't start now. It was there with Biden, it was there with Trump 1, it was even a bit there with Obama. So there is a general direction of the US pulling back, but what is different now is that while it pulls back from being the guarantor, it's also a predator. That we have not seen before. So this combination of not wanting to be responsible for things, but also being overtly predatory, that's very dangerous.
Okay, because you have mentioned at the beginning of your answer, if we are seeing an impasse where things will go back to normal, or this is going to be definite.
Normal is a big word, but anyway.
Yeah. Whatever was before, right? But you have the opposite conviction. Before going back to Europe, can you tell me what makes you believe this? That the US is going to keep in this crazy direction that it's heading?
For a number of reasons. I think that, first of all, this is not just a Trump moment. This is a broader US moment. The US has gone into an isolationist phase, let's say. We don't know how long it's going to last. And if you look into specific areas, for example, are we going to see a rollback of tariffs? Maybe some of the excesses of tariffs, but is the next US administration, whether it's Democratic or Republican, going to really roll back tariffs when they have already spent the money of that in terms of lower taxes? How are they going to explain that? And the reason why this is hard is because it goes to the first issue that I was mentioning before, which is that the contestation of globalization, which Americans basically blame free trade, for a lot of what's happening in the country. I think it's the wrong culprit. It's not trade, it's other things. It is technology to a certain extent, but it's also how markets have operated and the willingness of the U.S. economy, of the U.S. in general, to allow huge inequalities which have penalized people. But basically a lot of people blame free international trade for the fact that they have no jobs. And so it's going to be very hard to roll back from that. That's one issue. The second one is trust. The US has lost an incredible amount of trust around the world at the moment. Will it be able to regain that trust simply by a change of person in the White House? It's going to take time.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think that globalization is effectively going back then?
No, I don't. I think it's plateauing a little bit, and it is changing in terms of how it operates. It is no longer the sort of hyper-globalization that we saw until let's say the global financial crisis and a little bit after that. It is now much more fragmented, it's much more strategic, it is much more structured around our allies, not just around efficiency. And you've got an efficiency principle, which is kind of playing at the same time as a strategic principle and a rivalry principle. So countries want to be more resilient. That means redundancies in whatever they do, not necessarily pure efficiency, which was the old globalization. So it is changing in nature, but certainly if you look at the data, you see trade to GDP being flat, investment continuing to increase after having dropped during the financial crisis, and other aspects of globalization, such as data, exploding, right? With some fragmentation also, like the Chinese internet versus others. But it is not that we're becoming less interconnected. We're becoming interconnected in a different way than we were.
Okay. Also, since you are studying these topics and you just recently have this new book on how this situation is unraveling, we see it also impacts different international organizations. So if you see probably World Health Organization, everybody wants to get out of there, seemingly. World Trade Organization, just it's a paper, seemingly, and nothing more behind it, no enforcement, no anything. While, for example, my remit, which is the central banks, we see that Basel still gets together, central bankers talk to each other. So what does explain this thing that some areas work better than others, and what does it mean to work better in this context also?
So this is yet another of the paradoxes of the moment, right? The organizations that seem to be having the most trouble are those that are, on paper, most robust. So if you take the World Health Organization or the World Trade Organization, they are universal. They have, it's one organization which has almost universal membership. There is, in the case of WTO especially, there is a mechanism for compulsion, right? So there's a legal background, there's a legal basis which is very strong. So you would have thought that these would be able to withstand the pressure most. Instead, they're the ones crumbling first. And the policy areas where global governance seems to kind of work are the ones that rely on other mechanisms, which are softer, which are sometimes below the radar, which are not necessarily based on decisions of governments. And you mentioned financial flows, or banking, for example. What I would call, and we call in the book, behind the border integration, where you've got independent competition authorities, for example, across countries that coordinate and do a reasonably good job in coordinating. The Basel Convention, which operates independently, and it's a coordinate and review kind of model. So these kind of more informal, almost organic way of doing governance seem to, at the moment, be working and delivering some results. And that's hopeful.
Okay, that's interesting. And I want to, since we need to move on to our next topic, because you mentioned the low-hanging fruit that the EU can take to accommodate its way in the middle of this, I don't know if to say chaos, because maybe it's another thing that is not really chaos, but we are not yet seeing it because change is painful. But what is that low-hanging fruit?
The EU is actually in a position, it's got a window of opportunity which it never had before. Because what we do at the moment is we all stress about the fact that, oh my God, we are between the US and China. We are less competitive than the US, and we cannot compete with China on a bunch of things. We're behind in AI, and we're not a geopolitical actor. So, we are kind of wallowing in our own despair. But at the same time, the EU has an absolutely unique opportunity to shine here. This is because it is much more stable than the US is. It is democratic while China is not. It is a entity of 450, 500 million people with rules, with order, with pretty much shared values, not on everything, but pretty much shared values. And all it needs to do is to accept that it needs to work collectively and overcome some of the national difficulties. and to be able to have a much, much stronger role. And when I say a low-hanging fruit, I mean, we know what it is. We all, you ask 10 European economists, 9 were going to give you the same list that I would give you. Complete the savings and investment union, do a EU safe asset. Some of the things that have now been passed, not a EU safe asset, but have been passed by the European Council as a blueprint for the next year and a half. Let's see if it's going to happen. But that's what I mean in terms of it being low-hanging fruit. The rest of the world is looking for someone to come and, because they don't want to be aligned necessarily with either the US or China. We are more comfortable. We have a currency that is not being used as in such a predatory way as the dollar or the renminbi. Why do we not push more for the international role of the euro? To do that, you need the things that I mentioned before. You need a safe asset to be able to attract people to the currency. You need the savings and investment union for the savings to stay here. So, that's what I mean, and that's what gives you the kind of soft power that can then also become hard power. We need a common defense policy in the EU. We need to be able to play the role, which we're already playing. I mean, the US is no longer funding Ukraine. We are, right? So we need a European defense industry so as not to be reliant. We need to be sovereign in our data. There's a number of things that we are recognizing. We're just not moving fast enough to be able to do them.
Now, I again need to rush a bit because we started with these troubles with the technical stuff, and I also didn't introduce you, by the way, which you're a professor at the School of Transnational Governance here at the UI. You were also the director of that school, and you also have this practical experience where you were Minister of Finance, and you mentioned the economists in your confusion and how they are disconnected with the times that we are living in, meaning adapting to the politics. And I will ask you the broader question, like, is academia in general adapting to the times that we are living in? Because we could ask the same question about law schools, maybe. We could ask if whatever the research we do here is being effectively translated to informed decisions, and if politicians care at all about the things that we say, or they just use us to justify whatever decision they have taken before.
Look, it really depends on I mean, academia is something that starts from history and law and ends up in engineering and computing, right? Mm-hmm. So different bits of this huge spectrum are more directly relevant to daily life and to advances in business or in the economy. Social sciences face a particular problem in that they're always seen as removed from what is going on, and perhaps with the exception of economics, which likes to think that it is closer. Why do we need history? Why do we need political science?
We have the data, and we have the models.
Yes. So the answer I can give you a very easy and almost glib answer to say that fundamentally long-term growth depends on the growth of knowledge, and the growth of knowledge comes from universities primarily, right? So I think that we don't need to prove that. I think it's there. It's established well in every single empirical paper that there is. The question is, how do universities today engage with policymakers? And there, it's a difficult relationship, because you need to be relevant, but not a slave to what a policymaker wants. A university, especially a research university like ours, is not one that needs to provide everyday policy papers on the next issue. We're not a consultancy, we're not a think tank. We are something different. We're supposed to be doing deeper research, which is further back and which explores things that others would not do. And some of it is translated. So the really tricky bit is, how do you bridge that without losing your own soul, your independence, and your ability to look at things that other people would not want to, while giving the sense that you are indeed very relevant. That's why I'm really attached to the fact that in this place we do research, we teach, but we also train. We do trainings, and that becomes much closer. The training part becomes much closer to actual policy making. But we will never be in the rhythms and in the kind of daily rush of real political discourse, and we shouldn't be.
Thank you for that answer. I wonder, George, when you write your research, for example, this latest book, which audience do you have in mind? You target the policymakers, you target just everyone that wants to understand? Because I guess that the missing piece a little bit in all of this is also companies. How do you think they should adapt to this current moment, and how do they manage crisis in the times we're living in?
Well, I think all of us, again, part of the beauty of this place is that there is no uniformity in how we do our research, right? And that's true in many universities. It's true in this one. Different people bring different backgrounds. Necessarily, given my background, I am much more oriented in my writings to address policy, but to address the general public also, but to also address business, because that's an important part. I mean, think of climate change, for example. If you're thinking of the governance of climate, if you don't look at the role of companies in advancing new clean tech, then you're missing out a big picture. The reason why we have some hope of getting out to our climate goals is because the Chinese economy and therefore Chinese industry has made this huge green pivot, basically. So you can't leave that out of your analysis. Of course, you cannot. So in my case, the audience is a policymaker, but it's also people who are interested in policy, even if they're not making policy. If they're not decision makers in policy, they are analyzing it, or they're thinking about it as informed citizens who want to have an understanding of what's going on out there and what solutions we can collectively find.
Okay, let me know, George, when your clock is ticking, because I have just a few more points.
We have another 10-15 minutes.
Okay, perfect.
So don't rush me.
Okay, I'm enjoying very much this conversation. So I have a question about regulation. For some, it is the villain. For some, deregulation is the villain. We have too much, we have too little. I think the worst case scenario is having 27 different regulations of 27 EU countries, but yet some people say that the EU is over-regulated. What do you think is the role of regulation in our lives? Where do you stand on this debate?
I'll tell you what my problem is with the discussion on regulation. Somehow, the discussion on regulation has been about the EU regulation. But the EU regulation is a small part of the problem. I think if we are over-regulated, it is because member states, national countries, regulate, and then EU regulation comes on top of that. So rather than asking the EU to regulate less, why not ask each country to take a look at its regulations? Now, so one first problem to me is that we are putting too much of the onus on the EU, and we're not looking at each individual country. I think Italy has over-regulation on a number of things. It's not the fault of the EU. It is the fault of the way Italy has run its regulatory affairs for a very, very long time. Look at a very simple example. It's a silly example. Look at during COVID, the 2 pages of instructions that you had, the overly legal approach to many things that you have in this country, right? So that's one example. So that's the first thing. The second thing is regulation has become a dirty word. To me, it's not, because regulation gives you stability. It protects you. It protects the consumer. It protects the environment. Protects labor rights. Obviously, excess regulation is problematic, but we're not going to throw out the baby with the bathwater here. So when I read sort of big announcements of a complete review of all regulation, etc., I like to be a little bit careful. I want people to explain to me on a case-by-case basis, why are we over-regulating here and there? And especially when this comes from a push from US big tech to sort of impose their own extremely loose standards on Europe, which is one of the biggest markets in the world, where we should be setting up our own standards of privacy, our own standards of data access and ownership. These are value-driven regulatory initiatives that we do because we are Europeans and we believe that things should be in this way. And in that sense, we should not be railroaded by the US big tech with the US government behind it into dismantling our regulation simply because it is convenient for the people who own these companies.
Where do you think we stand in this discussion then with AI and all of this advancement? We don't have our own Google. We say we panic and then we try to follow up on.
So, okay, one of my big confusions is I hear we're clearly squeezed, right? What I do not know, and I genuinely don't know, and I would like to know more about this, is if you look at the AI stack, right, which starts from the energy which is necessary to drive the data centers, which the chips, the applications, the LLMs, the whole pyramid that exists with 5 or 6 layers. To be economies that grow and are much more productive through the use of AI without having the danger of somebody switching you off, where do you need to be present in this stack? That's something that I don't really know. I don't really know if we need to be... Okay, my hunch is we need to be present a little bit in every layer of the stack. But I do not know if there is a critical layer where if we miss it, we miss the entire train. Or, for example, if the LLMs become a commodity and you have 10 LLMs competing and low prices, we can simply be consumers of that. We don't necessarily have to be a big producer. But if it's going to be a monopolistic market with only one or maybe two, and they squeeze the rest, and those two are only the US, then we have a problem. And China clearly believes that it is going into that kind of direction and wants to be present in a big time. We are struggling. Our own LLMs are, and there's only Mistral, there's very little that we're doing. But do we just do that? How about how about the energy that is required to be able to run the data center? How about the relocalization of data centers and the cloud to Europe? So all these are issues. So I'm still looking for a coherent EU strategy that addresses the different levels of this. Maybe it exists one, I haven't seen it.
Okay, it's good to keep asking it though. George, before I let you go, I need to ask you about this genuine confusion that I have, which is how does a person survive a crisis like the one you had to manage when you were a minister? I imagine that moment, right? 2009. I imagine you thought, okay, the worst is over. And then you jump into the Ministry of Finance and then things got worse. Was there a moment where you said like, okay, this is worse than I thought I was going to take during that time?
There were many moments where there were many holy shit moments.
Okay.
Right? You have a series of such moments in a certain sense as things become apparent. But, when you are in everything, and it's not unique to me, I think most people in my position would do the same. When you're doing something, you get caught up in what you're doing it. So you never stand back, and if you stand back and look at it, you panic and you think, oh my God. But when you're actually doing it, it's a daily exercise of moving the ball forward, of trying to make the least bad decisions, because there are no good decisions there. It's the question is how much you can avoid bad decisions, right? And how you can communicate this to citizens, how you can convince your political party and government to go along, how you can negotiate with your European partners for a reasonable agreement that is a win-win.
But the way you tell it, it seems like you have no fear. Was there a moment where you you receive a call and it's like, Minister, this thing is worse than we imagined, and then you said, maybe I want to step down of this situation? Was there that moment, or you just went on? No, that's good.
No. There was no... there were many moments of unexpected news and critical decisions. But there was never a moment where I thought, I'm going to quit because this is too much. I'm not going to be able to do this. And that's because at that level, you feel a responsibility. And therefore, it's very hard to say, okay, I cannot do this anymore, right?
Did you always felt this call since you were like younger, or
no,
did you dream of being like a minister of finance when you were a kid?
Actually, no. I mean, I wanted to do policy analysis. I didn't think
like in high school you were.
No. When I was in high school, I wanted to be an economist, and when I was doing economics at the university and got my PhD, I wanted to be an analyst. And when I started working at the OECD, I wanted to do analysis. I never thought I would be involved in active politics. This came later. I didn't grow up thinking I want to be finance minister one day.
How did it happen?
It happened completely by fluke. It was because there was a government in the early 2000s that was looking for kind of Greeks abroad who had some expertise, and I was called in and I became an advisor to the Prime Minister, and that was an advisory role. It was a policy analysis, it was not frontline politics. And then after a few years they said to me, okay, now it's time for you to jump into the actual go run for office, which was an entirely different thing from what I was doing at the time, right? So, which I did. There was some history in my family of politics, so it was not completely alien to me in that sense.
Who was politician?
An uncle of mine, but in a different political party.
Okay.
He was center-right, I was center-left, right?
You changed sides.
So I changed sides. So, and then I failed the first time.
When you ran for office.
Yeah, and then I failed the second time, and then I got stubborn, and then I won on the third. And then after I won on the third, things happened.
You were running
for a constituency in the northwest of Greece for parliament. It's called Western Macedonia, and there's a municipality there, where a prefecture rather, where I ran.
And how is it to do those things, George? Because I imagine you going into campaigns and you were an analyst, and then it is humbling. Okay.
And it teaches you a hell of a lot. Because, you basically have to enter a kind of coffee shop or restaurant and start shaking everyone's hand, and you don't know these people, and I'm a bit shy, right? I'm not exactly the most extrovert of people. I learned how to be much more, but, you go in and you think, well, why do these people need to shake my hand? But you have to be out there, and you learn it after a while. And I can tell you, it's not the part of politics that I enjoyed the most, right? I mean, I learned how to do it. Some people just love that. And I loved the decision-making, the analysis, the conversations around the European tables. That's what got me most excited, right? But some people like the
contact with
the people, which I enjoyed, not always, and I learned a lot from it. I think that's a basic difference between the technocrat and a politician. A technocrat who's never run, has never been in the trenches, and has never actually asked people for their vote, where you look someone in the face and you tell him, vote for me. Yeah. That's not easy to do.
I can imagine.
It's not easy to do. And that teaches you a lot. It also gives you a perspective, because you think that everyone is interested about the bigger issues. No, people are interested about their own very particular issues. I'll tell you one little example, which is almost. I was in a remote village in the prefecture when I was running, and I was speaking, and I was talking about Greece's growth and all that, and Europe and the challenges. And I thought I was doing pretty well, right? This was very early days. I didn't know better. And at the end, this guy says, this is all very nice, but at night, the bears come down and they eat our chickens. What are you going to do about that? All right. So, there's a distance between the high-level policy analysis that we're used to doing in university and in think tanks and in international organizations like the OECD, even as a policy analyst working for a government, and down in the trenches. So somehow, I think politics should marry the two, because if you only do the technocratic part, then you don't understand what the world is. But if you only do that and you don't understand the technocratic part, then you take terrible decisions which are short-term and completely clientelistic. So you need to marry the two, and it's not very easy.
No, I imagine. I wonder what did you do with those bears, though, eating the chicken?
Not very much. I explained that the role of the member of parliament does not extend to dealing with bears.
No,
but I said I would look into it.
Okay, that's a good answer. George, was there a time that was particularly difficult for you that you look back and you say, damn, I wish somebody would have advised me on this, on that?
There were a number of moments in the process, because I mean, remember that the Greek crisis and the eurozone crisis was something we had never seen before. We never had the prospect of a member of the eurozone potentially defaulting, right? So we never had the prospect of a member of the eurozone not able to pay its bonds and therefore declaring bankruptcy. We never had such hard, comprehensive programs of fiscal consolidation, which involved drastic cuts in wages and salaries and pensions and increases in taxation, completely upending people's lives, right? So this was a first, and not just for me, for sure, not just for the Greek political class, but also for Europe, right? So we were all learning, we were all improvising. Improvisation is not always a bad word if you're trying to find a solution, right? So there were many moments where we were looking at each other thinking, what are we doing exactly here? So, yeah.
Okay. If you were to give an advice to your younger self, imagine you in university, what would you tell?
There's different advice at different parts of the of my university career. I should have done a bit more finance, because then I had to do a crash course when I mean, I'm an economist, but I was not specialized in finance, right? So finance came afterwards, but in the middle of the crisis. So that's one. And as a young politician and minister, when I look back, and that's actually part of the material that I show people when we do a class on crisis communications, right? It is the need to have empathy when you're actually dealing with these situations, and to take a step back. And sometimes I look at myself back then and I think, you didn't come across as somebody who actually cared. I did enormously, but I was so often caught into the moment of needing to get to the next payment, to be able for the country to not default, to get to the next steps, that sometimes I didn't take a step back and feel the situation a little bit more and see how people felt it, right? So that technocratic element, overly technocratic element, needs to be tempered sometimes.
That's so interesting, because, I think that I think about my own country in the way in which sometimes some of your colleagues who know, for example, the Minister of Economy of Argentina, Sturzenegger, famous economist, and they think that things are going very well, and I see them so detached from the pain of the regular folks, even though but we have this superávit, we have fiscal balance, but but there's a part when if you're insulting the people all the time, I don't think it helps.
So what is incredible is the detachment between the macro and the micro.
Absolutely.
One of the most humbling moments for a politician is when you go to the morning show on TV, which is what everybody watches, and you give your spiel about how the economy, we have to go through this because blah blah, and then the next day is going to be better because yes, there will be growth will go down, but the same investment will come back, and whatever. You give the whole thing, right? And then the next question is a micro story of this lady whose pension has been cut and who's having trouble and whose son has been unemployed, and she's actually not only has a lower pension, but she's also helping her son make ends meet. And Minister, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah.
And there is no answer to that.
I can imagine there is not. And, well, George, you have been fantastic. You have been very generous. And we need to close the show with our question, which is, what's the strangest thing that you saw this week? We always do this one, so I may start with something that is very obvious, but we seem to be going to the hantavirus crisis again, which it begs the question, are we go through the same stuff that we've been through? Do you think the world will survive another pandemic?
Well, let's hope that this is not another pandemic, but for sure we haven't quite learned the lessons of the last pandemic.
Okay. And what is your strangest fact?
That was one that I was going to mention. That the sort of visions of 2020 by seeing the people on the cruise ship. But there's been one of the problems that nothing surprises anymore. Like we live through surreal times. So things that I give you a couple of examples because I don't have one.
But in fact, this section is to make this exercise to recover the capacity of. Okay,
so should we be surprised when Vladimir Putin proposes Gerhard Schroeder as the man to negotiate peace in Ukraine? It's almost as if
explain to our audience why that is.
Well, it's because this is a former German chancellor that is now very close to Russia, so it's almost as if he's trolling us, right? So that's an example of the surreal. One of the fun things that I watched last week, and I think encapsulates a lot of what's the problem at the moment, is the Met Gala. Do you know the Met Gala in New York?
Yeah, I seen something.
So the Met Gala
I've seen dresses mostly.
But the Met Gala this year was basically bought by Jeff Bezos.
Oh, really? Another thing that he bought.
Yes. So we live in this kind of surreal world where big corporate money in the tech industry seems to be running the world in different ways, and that's surreal and very dangerous.
That's scary. You're right, George. I'm gonna give you the strangest prize this week. We normally compete with the facts, but you can choose whatever is your strangest prize as a token for your participation in the show, and then we show it to our audience.
Let's take this nice little fish here.
You take the weird fish. Let's show it to the camera. George is taking this
cute
prize.
Little weird fish.
This is your token for participation in this program. Thank you very much, and see you around.
Thanks a lot.
You have been great.